Imagine driving across the United States at night. The road is quiet. Small towns appear one after another. Gas stations glow under dim lights. Houses sit quietly along the roadside. But decades ago, for millions of Americans, some of those towns carried a terrifying rule. If you were the wrong race, you were not allowed to be there after sunset. Not because of an official national law, not because of a court order, but because entire communities had decided that certain people did not belong. Across the United States, there were towns where a simple sunset could mean danger, harassment, arrest, violence, sometimes even death. They were called sundown towns. And at their peak, there may have been thousands of them across the country. Many people today have never heard of them. Others assume they were rare or limited to the Deep South. But the truth is far more surprising. These towns existed across the Midwest, the North, the West, and parts of the South. Some of them lasted for decades, and their legacy still shapes communities today. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to a moment in history when the United States was trying to redefine itself after one of the most difficult periods it had ever faced. Because the story of sundown towns begins just after the end of the Civil War. Please like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment the next video topic in the comments. When the American Civil War ended in 1865, the country entered a period of enormous uncertainty. 4 years of conflict had devastated cities, destroyed infrastructure, and taken hundreds of thousands of lives. But the most important change was the end of slavery. For generations, millions of Black Americans had lived in bondage, denied basic rights, and treated as property. Suddenly, that system was gone. Freedom brought possibilities that had been unimaginable only a few years earlier. Black Americans could legally travel, work for wages, start businesses, and build independent communities. Across the South, newly freed families began searching for relatives who had been separated during slavery. Churches, schools, and local organizations began forming as communities tried to build new lives. During this time, the federal government attempted to reshape the nation through a period known as Reconstruction. New laws granted Black men the right to vote. For the first time in American history, Black citizens began holding political office in local governments and state legislatures. In many places, the changes were dramatic. Formerly enslaved people were now participating in politics, purchasing land, and pursuing education. But these changes also created intense resistance. Many white Americans, especially in the South, feared losing political power and economic control. Groups formed with the goal of restoring racial hierarchies that had existed before the war. Violence and intimidation became common tactics used to discourage Black political participation. Over time, these efforts helped dismantle many of the protections created during Reconstruction. By the late 1870s, federal troops withdrew from the South, and many of the gains made by Black citizens began to disappear. Southern states gradually implemented a system of laws designed to enforce racial segregation. These laws restricted where Black Americans could live, work, and travel. But something important was happening outside the South as well. Northern and Western communities were watching these events closely. Many white residents in those regions did not support slavery, but they still held strong racial prejudices. As Black Americans began moving more freely around the country, some communities worried about what demographic change might mean for their towns. Would property values change? Would jobs become more competitive? Would social norms shift? These fears created a powerful motivation for some communities to control who could live within their borders. At first, this control happened informally. A Black family might move into a town only to face harassment from neighbors. Employers might refuse to hire them. Local landlords might refuse to rent to them. Sometimes the pressure became so intense that families felt forced to leave. Other times, violence erupted. There were cases where mobs forced Black residents out of entire towns. Homes were burned. Businesses were destroyed. Families fled overnight to avoid further danger. These events were sometimes referred to as racial expulsions. In the aftermath, many communities quietly rebuilt themselves as entirely white towns. Once Black residents were gone, local leaders and residents worked to keep it that way. Over time, the idea spread. Some towns began creating systems to ensure that non-white residents could not settle permanently. Instead, they were allowed to enter during the day for work, but expected to leave before nightfall. This arrangement allowed towns to benefit from labor while preventing minorities from becoming permanent residents. The system may not have been written into national law, but it became widely understood in many communities. And once these practices began spreading, they started shaping entire regions of the country. But the true expansion of sundown towns would come during a massive demographic shift that changed the population of the United States. A movement involving millions of people searching for safety, opportunity, and a better life. It would become known as the Great Migration, and it would transform the country in ways few people at the time could have imagined. At the beginning of the 20th century, the United States began experiencing one of the largest internal migrations in its history. Millions of Black Americans began leaving the rural South. Some traveled by train. Others packed their belongings into wagons or early automobiles. Many left with little more than hope and a destination whispered by relatives or friends. They were searching for opportunity. For generations, the South had offered limited freedom and limited economic mobility for Black families. Sharecropping systems kept many people trapped in poverty. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation in nearly every part of daily life. Violence and intimidation remained constant threats. The North and the Midwest seemed to offer something different. Industrial cities were expanding rapidly during the early 1900s. Factories needed workers. Railroads were growing. Steel mills, meatpacking plants, and manufacturing centers required enormous amounts of labor. Employers began recruiting workers from the South. For Black families, this offered something rare: a chance to earn steady wages, a chance to live in cities where voting rights were more accessible, a chance to escape the rigid racial system that had dominated the South. So they moved. Between 1916 and 1970, millions of Black Americans relocated to cities across the country in what historians now call the Great Migration. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh saw their Black populations grow dramatically. But the migration also created tension. Many white communities outside the South had never experienced significant racial diversity before. Suddenly, they were confronted with the possibility that their neighborhoods, schools, and political systems might change. Some residents welcomed the newcomers. Others reacted with fear. Rumors began spreading through towns and cities. People worried that property values might fall. Others feared competition for jobs. Local newspapers sometimes fueled these anxieties with sensational headlines and exaggerated stories. As migration continued, some communities began looking for ways to control who could live within their borders. In certain places, that control took the form of violence. There were towns where white residents organized mobs to drive Black families out. Sometimes it began with a single accusation, a rumor about a crime, a conflict between neighbors, a dispute at a workplace. The rumor spread quickly. Within hours or days, crowds gathered. Black families were threatened, assaulted, or forced to leave. Homes were vandalized. Businesses were destroyed. Entire neighborhoods were emptied. In some cases, these expulsions happened in a single night. Families fled with whatever belongings they could carry. Once they were gone, local leaders ensured they never returned. Word spread quickly among surrounding communities. Certain towns had made it clear that Black residents were not welcome. Other towns saw what had happened and followed the same path. This pattern repeated across many regions of the country. Small towns in the Midwest began quietly removing Black populations. Communities in states like Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin experienced these expulsions. Western states were not immune either. Towns in California, Colorado, and Oregon developed reputations for excluding minorities. Sometimes the expulsions were openly discussed. Other times they were quietly forgotten by local histories. But the result was the same. Entire communities became all white. And once that status was established, towns often worked hard to keep it that way. Local police sometimes played a role by monitoring who entered the community. Real estate agents refused to sell homes to minority families. Employers avoided hiring non-white workers for permanent positions. Over time, an informal system emerged. In many towns, minorities could enter during the day to work, but were expected to leave before sunset. Black domestic workers might clean homes during the day. Janitors might work in office buildings. Laborers might work in factories or farms. But when evening arrived, they were expected to return to nearby cities or segregated neighborhoods. These rules were not always written down, but everyone understood them. In some places, towns posted signs at their borders making the rule explicit. Travelers entering town would see warnings telling them they needed to leave before dark. The message was simple. You could work here. You could spend money here. But you could not live here. As the decades passed, this practice became deeply embedded in certain communities. By the middle of the 20th century, the number of towns enforcing these rules had grown dramatically. Researchers who later studied these patterns estimated that thousands of communities across the United States functioned as sundown towns at some point during the 20th century. Some were small farming towns. Others were growing suburbs outside major cities. Many existed in states that people did not normally associate with segregation. This widespread system shaped the geography of American life. It determined where families could buy homes, where children could attend school, where businesses could be built. For Black Americans traveling across the country, it created an invisible map of danger. Certain towns were safe, others were not. And because the risks were so serious, families learned to plan their movements carefully. Routes were chosen based on safety. Trips were timed to ensure travelers passed through hostile areas before nightfall. Parents warned their children about towns where they should never stop. But even with careful planning, danger could still appear unexpectedly. Sometimes a traveler simply needed gas, or a car broke down in the wrong place, or night arrived sooner than expected. In those moments, the unwritten rules of sundown towns could suddenly become very real. And the next chapter explores how these communities enforced those rules. Because maintaining a sundown town required more than signs or rumors. It required a system of intimidation powerful enough to keep people away long after the sun had disappeared below the horizon. By the time sundown towns became widespread across the United States, something unusual had developed. Many of these towns did not rely heavily on official written laws. Instead, they relied on something more powerful: shared understanding. Everyone in the community knew the rule. You did not have to see it written down. You did not need a police officer to explain it. Residents grew up hearing about it from parents, neighbors, and local stories. Certain people were simply not supposed to remain in town after dark. In many places, that understanding was reinforced through routine encounters. If a Black traveler stopped at a gas station late in the evening, the clerk might casually mention that the town was not a good place to stay overnight. If someone unfamiliar was seen walking down a street after sunset, neighbors might call the police. A patrol car might pull up beside the person and ask questions. Where are you going? Where are you staying tonight? How long are you planning to be in town? Often the message was delivered politely but clearly. It would be better if you left before nightfall. But sometimes the message was not polite. Some towns relied on intimidation that bordered on harassment. Police officers might stop minority drivers repeatedly as they passed through town. Drivers might be followed by patrol cars from the edge of town to the opposite city limit. Residents might gather outside homes or businesses to watch anyone they considered an outsider. The constant surveillance created a feeling that certain people simply did not belong. And in some towns, the intimidation escalated even further. Groups of residents sometimes organized what they called night patrols. These patrols were not official police units. They were simply groups of citizens who believed it was their responsibility to protect the racial boundaries of their community. After sunset, they would drive through town looking for anyone who might be violating the unwritten rule. Sometimes the patrols were little more than watchful neighbors, but in other cases they became aggressive. Cars might pull up beside travelers and demand that they leave. Shouting matches could quickly turn into threats. And in some of the worst situations, violence followed. Stories of these encounters traveled quickly among Black communities. Families passed warnings down through generations. Do not stop in that town. Do not drive that road after dark. If you must pass through, keep moving. Never break down there. These warnings created what many Black travelers described as an invisible map. A mental map of safe towns and dangerous towns. Some communities were known for being relatively welcoming. Others had reputations that stretched across entire states. If a traveler mentioned the name of a particular town, people immediately understood what it meant. Keep driving. Do not stop. This reputation often worked as effectively as any law, because fear could travel faster than enforcement. Once a town became known as hostile, most people simply avoided it. The town did not need to enforce its rules frequently because the reputation alone kept outsiders away. But there were moments when travelers accidentally crossed those invisible boundaries. A car might run out of gas. A tire might go flat. A family might need to find food or a bathroom for their children. Those moments could turn an ordinary road trip into a frightening experience. Imagine being stranded in a town where everyone is watching you, where every glance carries suspicion, where every minute brings the sun closer to the horizon. For many Black travelers, this was not imagination. It was a real risk they faced whenever they traveled through unfamiliar territory. And that constant uncertainty changed the way people moved across the country. Road trips required careful planning. Routes had to be chosen based on safety rather than convenience. Families needed to know exactly where they could safely stop for food, fuel, or sleep. Out of that necessity, something remarkable was created. A guide that became one of the most important survival tools for Black travelers in the 20th century. It listed places where travelers would be welcome, places where they could eat, sleep, and refuel without fear. This guide spread across the country, passed from family to family, and carried in glove compartments during long road trips. And its existence revealed just how widespread sundown towns had become. Because the guide was not small, it needed to cover an entire nation filled with places that were not safe. The next chapter explores the creation of that guide and what it reveals about traveling through a deeply divided country. By the 1930s, millions of Americans owned automobiles. The open road had become a symbol of freedom. Families could travel across states, explore new cities, visit relatives, and see parts of the country that previous generations could never easily reach. Highways connected rural towns with growing urban centers. Roadside diners, gas stations, and small motels appeared along long stretches of highway. For many Americans, the automobile represented independence. But for Black travelers, the freedom of the road came with a very different reality. Driving through unfamiliar towns could be dangerous. A simple stop for gas might turn into a tense encounter. A request for a hotel room might be refused. A restaurant might deny service entirely. And if night arrived in the wrong place, the danger could grow quickly. Because by the early 20th century, thousands of communities across the country had quietly developed reputations for excluding Black residents after dark. Some towns made the rule obvious with posted warnings. Others never displayed signs, but enforced the same rule through intimidation and harassment. For Black travelers, every journey required careful planning. Families had to think about questions that most other travelers never considered. Where could they safely stop to eat? Which towns had hotels that would accept them? Which gas stations would serve them without hostility? Which highways should be avoided after sunset? The answers to those questions were not always easy to find. So Black communities created their own solution. During the 1930s, a travel guide began circulating that would become one of the most important road companions for Black travelers in the United States. The guide listed safe places to stay, eat, and refuel across the country. Hotels that welcomed Black guests. Restaurants willing to serve them. Service stations where drivers could fill their tanks without fear of harassment. Private homes that offered lodging when hotels were unavailable. The guide was updated regularly as new businesses opened and others closed. For families planning road trips, it became essential. A journey that might otherwise feel risky suddenly had a map of safe destinations. But the very existence of such a guide revealed something troubling. There were enough dangerous places across the country that travelers needed an entire book just to avoid them. Imagine driving hundreds of miles and knowing that many towns along the way would refuse to serve you. Imagine needing to plan your meals, rest stops, and overnight stays days in advance simply to stay safe. For Black families, this was not unusual. It was simply the reality of travel. Parents taught their children strict rules for road trips. Always fill the gas tank before entering unfamiliar areas. Do not stop in towns that have bad reputations. If a police officer pulls you over, remain calm and respectful. If a restaurant refuses service, leave quickly and move on. And perhaps the most important rule of all, never be caught in a hostile town after dark. Stories circulated about travelers who ignored those warnings. Some were stopped repeatedly by local police. Others were chased out of town by angry residents. In the worst cases, violence erupted. These stories traveled through communities, passed from family to family. They reinforced the invisible map of safe and unsafe places. Certain highways became known as safer routes. Certain towns became infamous for hostility. And because many of these communities were located along major travel routes, avoiding them could require long detours. But even with careful planning, accidents still happened. Cars broke down. Storms forced travelers off the road. Children became hungry or sick. Sometimes families had no choice but to stop in towns where they were not welcome. Those moments could quickly turn tense. A family pulling into a gas station late in the evening might feel every pair of eyes watching them. Conversations would stop. Customers might stare. The air could feel heavy with suspicion. Would they be served? Would they be told to leave? Would someone call the police? These situations created a level of stress that most travelers never had to consider. Yet for decades, millions of Americans experienced the road this way. Travel required courage, preparation, and constant awareness of surroundings. And the system that created these conditions did more than shape travel. It shaped where people could live, build businesses, and create generational wealth. Because sundown towns were not only about who could pass through. They were about who could settle down, who could buy homes, who could build communities that would last for generations. And the next chapter explores how these housing restrictions played a powerful role in shaping economic inequality that still echoes today. Because the rules of sundown towns were not just social customs. They were tied to systems that determined who had access to opportunity and who was pushed to the margins of American life. By the middle of the 20th century, sundown towns were doing more than controlling who could travel through a community. They were shaping who could build a future there. Because the most powerful part of these towns was not always the signs or the threats or the warnings after sunset. It was the housing. In the United States, home ownership has long been one of the primary ways families build wealth. When someone buys a home, they are not just purchasing a place to live. They are investing in property that may increase in value over time. If the neighborhood grows, the home becomes more valuable. That value can be passed down to children and grandchildren. Over decades, home ownership can transform the financial stability of an entire family. But sundown towns often made sure that opportunity was available to only one group of people. White residents, Black families, and other minorities were frequently prevented from buying property in these communities. Sometimes the barriers were obvious. Real estate agents simply refused to sell homes to minority buyers. Landlords refused to rent apartments. Neighbors pressured sellers not to accept offers from non-white families. Other times the barriers were hidden within legal documents. Property deeds in many neighborhoods included restrictive clauses that prohibited homes from being sold to certain racial or ethnic groups. These restrictions were written directly into the paperwork that transferred ownership of the house. If a homeowner tried to sell to someone who did not meet the racial requirement, the sale could be challenged or blocked. Entire neighborhoods used these restrictions to maintain racial homogeneity. In many cases, local governments supported these practices indirectly. Banks often refused to approve mortgages for minority families trying to buy homes in certain neighborhoods. Insurance companies sometimes refused to provide coverage in areas where Black families lived. These policies created what later became known as redlining. Banks and lenders would draw lines around neighborhoods they considered undesirable and refused to provide loans there. Many of those neighborhoods were areas where Black families lived or were attempting to move. The result was a system where white families were encouraged to buy homes in expanding suburbs, while Black families were often limited to specific urban neighborhoods. Those suburban communities frequently overlapped with sundown towns, places that allowed minorities to work nearby but not live within the town limits. As the decades passed, this separation had enormous economic consequences. White families who purchased homes in suburban areas saw property values rise steadily as cities expanded. Homes bought for modest prices in the 1940s or 1950s often became extremely valuable by the end of the century. Those homes could later be sold for large profits or passed down to children. Meanwhile, many minority families were locked out of those same housing markets. Instead, they rented homes in areas where property values increased more slowly or where housing conditions were poorer. Without access to mortgages or property ownership, it was far more difficult to accumulate wealth. The difference between owning and renting may seem small at first, but over generations it creates enormous gaps. A family that owns property for 50 years can build significant financial stability. A family that rents for the same period may never gain that same advantage. Sundown towns helped create and protect those differences. They ensured that certain communities remained closed to minority families during the decades when suburban growth was transforming the American economy. New highways connected suburbs to cities. Factories created stable middle-class jobs. Schools expanded. Property values climbed. But many families were excluded from participating in that growth. And because wealth often passes from parents to children, those early exclusions continued shaping economic patterns long after the original rules disappeared. By the 1960s, the civil rights movement began challenging these systems more aggressively. Activists protested housing discrimination. Lawyers filed lawsuits against restrictive covenants and discriminatory lending practices. Communities began questioning the fairness of a housing system that excluded people based on race. These challenges slowly began weakening the legal structures that supported sundown towns and racially exclusive neighborhoods. But the process was slow. Some towns resisted change. Others quietly maintained the same patterns even after laws began shifting. Eventually, national legislation would attempt to address these inequalities. A law designed to prohibit housing discrimination across the United States. It would become one of the most important legal turning points in the history of segregation. And in the next chapter, we will explore how that law began dismantling the official systems that allowed sundown towns to exist. But even as laws changed, many communities faced a difficult question. How do you undo decades of exclusion? And what happens to the legacy left behind when those barriers finally begin to fall? By the 1950s and 1960s, the United States was entering one of the most transformative periods in its history. Across the country, citizens began demanding that the promises of equality written into the Constitution finally become reality. The civil rights movement had begun challenging segregation in every part of American life. Schools, buses, restaurants, and workplaces were being questioned and tested in courts and in public protests. But one of the most powerful battlegrounds was housing, where people live shapes nearly every part of their lives. Schools are tied to neighborhoods. Job opportunities are often tied to where someone can afford to live. Access to transportation, safety, and community resources all depend heavily on location. For decades, housing discrimination had quietly shaped American cities and towns. Black families and other minorities were frequently blocked from buying homes in certain neighborhoods. Sometimes the restrictions were written directly into property documents. Other times banks refused loans or real estate agents refused to show homes. These practices kept many communities racially segregated even outside the South. But during the mid-20th century, legal challenges began targeting these systems. One of the earliest major turning points came when courts ruled that restrictive housing agreements could no longer be legally enforced. These agreements had previously allowed neighborhoods to ban the sale of homes to certain racial groups. Once courts ruled that these restrictions could not be enforced, the legal structure supporting many all-white neighborhoods began to weaken. But change was far from immediate. Even after the court decision, many communities found new ways to discourage minority residents. Neighbors pressured sellers not to sell their homes to black families. Real estate agents quietly steered buyers toward specific neighborhoods based on race. Banks continued to deny loans in areas they considered undesirable. The unwritten rules of segregation remained powerful even when the written rules began disappearing. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, civil rights activists pushed for stronger protections. Protests and demonstrations drew national attention to discrimination in housing. Television broadcasts showed Americans scenes of segregation that many people outside the South had rarely seen before. The pressure for federal action grew. Finally, in the late 1960s, Congress passed one of the most significant housing laws in American history. The new law made it illegal to discriminate in the sale, rental, or financing of housing based on race. In theory, this law struck at the heart of the systems that had allowed sundown towns to exist. Communities could no longer openly exclude people from purchasing homes because of race. Real estate agents and landlords could face legal penalties for discriminatory practices. Banks could be investigated if they denied loans unfairly. On paper, the system that supported sundown towns had finally been dismantled. But laws alone cannot instantly erase decades of social behavior. In many places, the changes were slow. Some towns quietly began becoming more diverse as minority families moved into neighborhoods that had previously been closed to them. Other towns remained overwhelmingly white for years, sometimes because of lingering hostility, sometimes because the housing market itself had already been shaped by decades of exclusion. A community that had been all white for 50 years might simply remain that way because few minority families had the resources to buy homes there. The legacy of past restrictions continued influencing where people lived. Children grew up in neighborhoods shaped by decisions made decades earlier. Even when legal barriers disappeared, social patterns remained. But something important had changed. The open enforcement of sundown town practices was no longer legally acceptable. Communities could no longer publicly advertise racial exclusion. The signs that once warned travelers to leave before sunset gradually disappeared. Police departments could no longer openly enforce racial residency rules. For the first time in many decades, the legal framework supporting sundown towns was gone. Yet the disappearance of the rules raised another question. What happened to the towns themselves? Did they change? Did they become more welcoming places? Or did the legacy of exclusion continue shaping these communities long after the official rules disappeared? The final chapter explores that legacy. Because even though the signs and ordinances may be gone, the history of sundown towns still echoes in many places today. And understanding that history helps explain patterns that still exist across the United States. Don't forget to subscribe on your way out. See you next video.